You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in this show are that of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, Secular Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. How can I live in society if I don't believe in God? How can I understand the world around me without religion? What can I do to make the world a better place? Where did we come from? How can I be a moral person? These are just some of the profound questions we as humans have pondered for millennia. Join us as we ponder these questions free from the ideologies of religion and superstition. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective.
Hello, gentlemen. Welcome back for another episode. With me today, we've got Christopher, we've got V, and we've got Andrew.
Yep.
V, recently you actually went to the American Humanist Association annual meeting in Chicago, I believe it was. What do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was an interesting experience. It was last Saturday, and the conference is held in different city every year, and this time it was in Chicago. So about 5 people of the FreeThought group made it out there. I think we had 1 or 2 people that were there for the entire conference, which was 3 or 4 days long, and 2 or 3 of us were only there for Saturday. From what I understand, about 400 to 500 people showed up, which with 5 representatives on Saturday means that the FreeThought Fort Wayne was 1% of the attendance or more. So that's kind of interesting. So what I caught while I was there were some panel discussions, lectures. We're able to talk with the grassroots coordinator for the AHA. That's probably the most interesting thing of all, was just talking to her. Her name is Rachel, and real interesting. She had some suggestions that we'll have to run through the board, and just for better ways to run the group and some things like that. But she was very impressed with all the events that we do. When I mentioned to her that we have a Sunday event and a Wednesday evening event, just a regular meetup. On top of that, we have the monthly events like lectures or helping the homeless and things like that. She was really, really impressed with all that, considering that we're only such a short-lived group. I think we've progressed much further than most groups would have by this time.
So you're saying we've evolved pretty quickly?
We have, yeah. We mentioned that we have on our, because I haven't been to the Wednesday evening meetings, but on the Sunday meetings, we mentioned that we get between 10 and 20 people to show up on a pretty regular basis, and sometimes more, actually, I think. And that's apparently pretty impressive for, kind of a regional group that we are. So very, very impressed by that. What I caught from the lectures and things like that, there was a panel discussion on equality and racism and things like that. And it was a diverse group of people that was on stage. Unfortunately, my contacts were bugging me, so I had to pull them out, and I couldn't really see who was on stage. So I could only hear their names. It was 2 girls and a guy, but I could barely make them out. But they had some very good points. Part of what I took away from that discussion was that until you've actually experienced discrimination, you don't really know what it's like. You can listen to it, you can study it, and all that. You can understand it, but you really have to experience it to get the feel for it, and to really understand what it's about. Um, then I caught a really interesting science lecture. The guy that gave the lecture was from the local, one of the, I don't know if there's more than one, but he was a Chicago chapter of the AHA. And he wasn't a scientist, but he's kind of an amateur scientist. And he made a really interesting lecture talking about, how Earth evolved and how it formed as a planet. He started basically at the Big Bang. He got to Earth. He got to how life formed on Earth and how life changed Earth. As some of the first living organisms evolved, they sucked so much carbon out of the atmosphere that we entered into an ice age because the greenhouse effect was diminished, and that's part of what keeps the temperature on Earth where it is even today. So very, very interesting lecture. Kind of went through the different stages of life and stuff like that. He had a big wheel on the screen that showed. It's kind of difficult to explain, but it basically showed all the branches of how the different species evolved and the different grouping, and how it went back to the original, to the beginnings of life, basically. And part of what was really interesting, he said what somebody may expect was that if you zoom in all the way on the middle of the diagram that he was showing, which would be like the very first life form, there wasn't really one life form. A simplistic view of evolution may drive you to believe that there was only one life form that started it, but he said what you would see in the middle would be more like a bush, because those original life forms, they would exchange genetic information very easily between them, so there wouldn't be well-defined species, at the very beginning of life. So that was a very interesting lecture. Very interesting points the guy made. Then the last thing that I caught was it was just a couple of humanist comedians. They did a little bit of a wrap up of what had happened until that point in the conference. Went over some of the previous discussions, kind of gave their viewpoint, tried to make it a little bit funny. It's kind of interesting outside of the meeting rooms and stuff. There was some vendors and things like that. So there was books for sale. There was you could buy little magnets and trinkets and T-shirts, things like that. What I found to be the most interesting out of all that was there was actually a religious school there recruiting. I mean, you wouldn't think there's many closeted believers at a humanist convention, but apparently they were hoping there is some. And the other very interesting thing, the men's bathroom that was closest to the meeting rooms was actually converted into, well, not really converted, but they put a sign over the men's room saying gender neutral bathroom, so anybody could go in there. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So I don't know. That's about it in a nutshell.
Awesome. Hopefully we can, have another group that will go up again in later years. That'll be close. I know that, and then the Freedom from Religion Foundation are two, conventions that I would love to go to, just to see some of the bigger, secular organizations in the nation really, come together and talk about and celebrate, their mission. So yeah. I'm definitely glad that we could represent, even if we were 1% of the attendees.
Yeah, fortunately, I think next year the conference is going to be If I remember correctly, I think they said Denver. I could be wrong, but I remember it was somewhere far.
I
For the
I
HA at least.
I do love Denver, but I've driven there many times, and that's not the most comfortable drive.
Oh, how
Uh,
far is it to drive?
It's about 20 hours.
yep.
Holy cow!
Yeah. So yeah, we used to go skiing out there. So it'd be about 20 hours to Denver, and then a couple more up into the mountains to get to any of the ski resorts.
Okay.
So and actually, most people don't realize that the most of the eastern half of Denver is flat. It's completely just like Kansas. Kansas is very flat as well. So driving through both of those states is boring. It's very, very uneventful.
Interesting, interesting. The other thing that would have been interesting to go to is the Reason Rally in
Yes.
DC, but you know it's kind of far too.
Yes, I was just doing some research on that. I saw Bill Nye was speaking. I know there were quite a few large names in the secular community going. Unfortunately, I know Johnny Depp was going to be there, but he pulled out a week or so beforehand because of some personal issues. But yeah, would love to go to the Reason Rally and have a blast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to mention. There was actually some interesting people at the AHA convention in Chicago. I was able to get a picture with the guy that calls himself the Friendly Atheist, Hemant Mehta.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was able to get a picture with him, so that's pretty cool. He was, of course, busy, but he got freed for about 10 seconds, and I pounced on the opportunity. So, yeah, it would be interesting to meet some of those people and to hear them speak for sure.
Oh, another thing about the Reason Rally in D.C., Ray Comfort was going to show up with a counter-protest group. And
Yes, and I heard that. I believe wasn't it the DC mayor or whoever it was saying you cannot counter protest because this is considered a rally, and they had permits and stuff where Ray Comfort's group would not have permits.
yeah,
So from a
I think
from a sanctioned.
I think he ended up going, but his plans were ruined. His plans to proselytize to all the heathens were ruined. Something about $25,000 worth of Subway gift cards. He was planning on giving out gift cards for people to talk to him, so he could probably grab snippets of stuff out of context for his next movie.
Oh, of course, of course.
Breaking Bread, I guess, has lost its appeal, so he's got to step it up to Subway.
My goodness. Well, that guy just crawl somewhere and hide. He has zero intelligence. Like,
Cuddle up with his
whatever
crocoduck.
Yeah, that was so ridiculous. When people misunderstand the science so profoundly, and when that has been explained to them so many times in so much detail, and they still don't get it, I mean, you gotta think that it's willful at that point in time.
Well, that's actually a great segue into our next discussion topic. Just discussing some of Rush Limbaugh's thoughts on this whole gorilla situation.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that the gorilla would have survived had it just evolved into a human. You know, Clearly that's how science works.
Yes.
Yeah.
See, most of the time, listening to Rush Limbaugh, a day or so after he makes statements like that, he'll talk about, the media, backlash and things and what other pundits are saying. And he usually tries to squirm away like, oh, well, I was just joking. I was being sarcastic in this. But listening to that statement he made, it was, he even said a couple times like, oh, I'm serious about this. I'm not joking. How is evolution real when Harambe, is that the
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah, Harambe is still human. So it's how does it's expecting to look at a wolf and throughout its lifetime change into a pug. It's never going to happen.
Gross misunderstanding of biology. It's
Yeah,
terrible.
that's all that is. I mean, to not be able to grasp the difference between a common ancestor and whatever he's referring to, like gorillas turning into humans. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
You can make the same argument that somebody would, somebody like me who is very white in color, in my skin color, I would all of a sudden get incredibly dark skinned to where it's almost pure black, just within my lifetime, which doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I can get tan, but I'm not going to magically, for no reason, get black skin. It's just never going to happen.
But they don't get that. Like somehow that's a very, very difficult concept for them to grasp, and I just don't get it. You know,
Yeah.
we had a common great, great, great grandfather. Not like one didn't turn into the other. Uh,
Oh,
so
was this kind of what you were talking about, V?
for what?
During the lecture, you mentioned a circular diagram of sorts. Can you see that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean the diagram that the guy was talking about was I mean it's kind of hard to explain, but rather than showing the tree of life as a tree, imagine just kind of wrapping all the branches around the circle
Okay.
kind of thing.
All right.
It's kind of
Yeah,
hard
I
to
figured
explain.
that's what you're. I figured that's what you're talking about. Yeah, those are always fun to look at. Just they're. I don't know. They can be called a number of things, whether they're a tree of life or a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree. I mean, it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
And that, in order to really understand it, once again, it requires a good amount of knowledge of how evolution works. In
Oh,
that
yeah.
there are many different organisms, and a lot of them become extinct
Mm.
and terminate. So,
Yeah.
Well, I think the big thing for people is we confuse monkeys and apes, and we think that creationists confuse common ancestor with a chimp. Like, oh, why are there still chimps if they've evolved? What they don't understand is it's not a chimp as we understand it today. It was a completely different species that was of common ancestry that both humans and now greater apes shared. So it's not a chimpanzee one day woke up and didn't have hairy knuckles and could stand completely erect. It's not like that.
Yeah.
yeah,
One
and
way
that
to kind of describe that that I think is a little more illustrative for people may be, um, we know that Latin is the language from which Spanish and other languages came, but there was never the case where a Latin-speaking mother gave birth to a Spanish-speaking child. Like they were always able to communicate. The drift happened very, very slowly. So to get back on track after a little mishap, um, the example that may be easy for people to understand, if they're confused about evolution and common ancestry and how that all happens, um, you know, let's say, let's take Latin language. It's the predecessor for both Spanish and French. It slowly morphed into Spanish, let's say, but there was never a case where a Latin speaking mother gave birth to a Spanish speaking child. They always spoke the same language. It just over successive generations, that language changed, and in one place it became Spanish, in another place it became French. Um, so that's kind of an example of how one thing can change into the other, and they have a common ancestor where you know it wasn't that Spanish or French morphed into the other, but they have a common ancestor in Latin. So to me that's a good example that people can understand easily.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. Just because if you think about how one language can have different dialects, just based on geography or other cultural factors. I mean, my wife, for example, she is not good with any accents. So anyone from Mississippi, Alabama, it might as well be talking a different language, even though they are talking, speaking in English. So yeah, so it's all the same, but there's different nomenclature and different localities for each of these little dialects.
And that is a great example because of the fact that you also have what's called dead languages, right? Which is kind of like an extinct species.
Yeah.
So it is very, very similar in that respect as well.
Yeah, the people that spoke that language died out, and just like a species would. Yeah, that's a great analogy. And I was going to mention something on the dialects thing. Here in the U.S., it's a big country, so you would expect that people in Texas would have a slightly different accent from people in New York. But that very same thing happens in much, much smaller countries. Back home in my home country, it's about the size of Indiana. I mean, you can go up in the mountains, which are just an hour and a half drive from my hometown, and you can barely understand what people are talking. Barely understand what they're saying. They're speaking Bulgarian. Like if you really listen, you can you can realize that it's the same language. But man, it is hard to understand, and that's in a small, small place. So, yeah, it's interesting how that happens.
Yeah.
So, do we want to move on to more of the gorilla thing and see what we all think?
Yeah, let's circle back to the whole thing with Harambe. So I'm sure most people have heard by now that at the Cincinnati Zoo, a child who was 2 or 3 years old,
3 or 4,
fell into the gorilla pen, and then proceeded, I think, for 10 minutes or so, to be dragged around by the gorilla. To the eventual shooting and killing of the gorilla in order to protect the child. And now, on social media and other media outlets, outrage, either one side or the other, backlash against the parents, saying that they should have been more focused on their child. From animal rights activists saying, we shouldn't have to shoot the gorilla for the kid's negligence. Or the parents' negligence, things like that. So since everyone else is talking about it, what do you guys think?
Well, I guess I'll start. Oh, no, go ahead, Andrew.
Right. For the people who say that the parents should have watched their child closer, and there could be a part to that, yes, but they probably haven't ever experienced children, like they haven't been a parent, because I turn around and either a kid's there when I know he was in the other room just a second ago, or I think you're in one room and they're gone, and sometimes that happens while we're out in public. Usually my kids are staying near me, but every now and then I think I'm keeping a close eye on them. I look away for a second to look at something else, look back, and they're gone. Kids do weird stuff.
I agree. I think it's just a very innocent thing that can happen in a blink of an eye, and I don't think there's much blame there to give the parents. I mean, it's not like they were planning on doing that. They didn't, help the kid into the enclosure, and they were very distraught. While everything was going on, the mother, called 911 to try to get help. It wasn't like they were being completely neglectful.
Yeah, my problem was mainly with the zoo, actually. I mean, I understand that as a parent, it takes a split second and that kid is over that fence. I mean, it's a 3-foot fence, so it's not especially tall, but, nothing that's insurmountable to a 3 or a 4-year-old. Any 3 or 4-year-old can climb over that thing in a few seconds. I'm glad that the kid didn't get hurt, because it was apparently a 15-foot drop that he went over, which seems like has probably caused more damage to the kid than anything that the gorilla did. My problem is, why weren't there, other ways to handle this animal other than just killing? I was reading an article saying that the staff in zoos drills for those kind of situations where somebody ends up in an enclosure, or for various emergencies of that type. And of course, as those things are, it never happens as the way you train. But one thing that I didn't hear anyone mention was, especially with the apes, like, why didn't anybody try to teach the gorillas how to handle such a situation? I mean, you have this ape that has supposedly the intelligence of a 4 or 5 year old itself. I mean, you should be able to teach it, hey, if something falls in there, just step away from it or just put it over there, and they can probably train with dolls or something like that. Give them, if they do things right, give them a big plate of whatever is their favorite food, get the positive reinforcement going. You can do all those things. But I don't know, I'm disappointed that that wasn't done.
No, playing devil's advocate, I did mention that most of the, criticism of the parents came from people who probably weren't parents. I would venture to guess that a much smaller portion of those people ever managed a zoo. So I don't have any experience with wild animals like that, but I'm sure they had drills and I'm sure they did things to prevent it. But I can't even imagine what was going through. What that decision-making process was during that. Who knows if they've ever had an emergency drill for situations like that. But I did hear in one place that they were worried about tranquilizing it because it could take up to 10 minutes for that to fully go into effect, and during that time he could become more aggressive. So I don't know if that was the right call or not, or how I would have handled it better if I was in that situation.
Yeah, tranquilizers don't quite work the way they do in movies, where they dart hits and immediately out.
Oh no!
And plus the gorilla, the gorilla was already panicked because the crowd of people are surrounding the enclosure screaming, and everyone's in a panic, so the gorilla is getting panicky, and that's evident in the video even.
Yeah, that's probably what did the most damage in the situation was, spooking the animal, and now it's frightened. It doesn't know what to do. It's got this little screaming thing in front of it. So, at first to me, it actually looked like the gorilla was trying to more or less protect the child. It seemed to be dragging it away from the crowd. But I guess you don't really know what's going on in his head. Now, one thing to point back to, this is not the first time when something like this has happened. In other cases, there's at least 2 other cases. In one of those, it was a female gorilla, and it just picked up the kid and left it by the door, where the handlers, the zoo people, can just pull the kid out. Not sure exactly what happened in the other case, but the child remained unharmed. An interesting fact that I read was gorillas are generally not aggressive towards people. There is very, very few cases where the recorded cases where anybody's been attacked or killed by a gorilla. Where if you try to look for people attacked by sharks, we probably can give you the GPS coordinates of everybody that's been attacked by a shark over the last 20 decades. And, that's probably like 20 cases or something like that. There's been very few attacks by gorillas, and they're generally not aggressive towards people. And even when they are, when a gorilla becomes defensive, the first thing they do is they make all kinds of noise. They beat their chest. They'll drag branches through the grass, through the ground, like try to warn you. They give a fair amount of warning before they become aggressive and attack. And where people have been attacked, it's apparently in cases where those very obvious warnings have been disregarded. And unfortunately, in the videos that they show for Harambe, you really can't see what happens past the first minute or two. He kind of pulls the kid to an area where whoever is filming that video is not able to capture it. So, it may be that the staff made the right choice. With the evidence presented, I remain unconvinced. Um, I don't blame the mother. I think the fault here falls squarely on the zoo for allowing this to happen by not designing the enclosure properly and potentially mishandling the case. But then again, I don't know since we couldn't see the last of it.
So there are a couple of things that are very interesting about this whole story. I talked about this a little bit on my show, but the couple things here. One is the fence or the barricade, so to speak. You're talking about it being 3 foot tall. Well, that's one thing. The other thing is that the fence was actually basically 3 steel wires separated by about 8-inch gaps. So it's really just designed to prevent walking people from going beyond that point. It wasn't really designed with a crawling toddler in mind. Mm-hmm. And so that explains how a toddler so quickly and efficiently was able to cross that 4-foot distance between the fence and the wall of the enclosure to then fall down into the moat. Now, like you were saying, 15 feet is quite a drop.
Oh, yeah.
So that probably would have killed the toddler on impact had there not been a foot of water in that moat.
Yeah.
And it being a light creature, so to speak, the toddler didn't take a whole lot of damage from the fall.
Yeah.
As such, it also buffered the toddler when the ape went around dragging it through the water. So you didn't have a whole lot of secondary damage by that either. So that kind of explains why the toddler was only in the hospital for a few hours and was quickly released. The thing that bothers me, okay, now I'm going to preface it with this. I don't have kids, I'm never going to have kids. However, I've been in the care of kids a number of times, my nieces in particular, as well as students at the elementary school level. And so my problem with this is that I wouldn't think a parent would lose sight or attention of their child if they were standing right next to a road. I don't think any responsible parent would do that. As such, if you're within 4 feet of a 15-foot drop, I would also expect you to have the sense to not lose attention of your child. And if you are monitoring a lot of children, which this mother is said to have been doing at the time, then for the children that are not old enough and responsible enough to know better, you should have them tethered to you using one of those backpack leashes or keep hold of their hand at all times. And if not, then you need to have somebody else, another adult, helping you supervise those kids. Otherwise, I just feel like that's irresponsible as a parent, to put your child in a dangerous situation and then not compensate for that. So that's my view on that. As far as the zoo being at fault, the zoo hasn't had any problems for the 38 years that Gorilla World's been open. During that time, they have been in compliance with all the standards set forth by the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums. So that 3-foot fence, even though it was a measly 3 steel wires, that met regulations. So they weren't necessarily breaking any kind of protocols there by having that fence. Now, of course, with this event happening, the association is probably going to up their standards and revisit some of those things to increase security in the future. But certainly, I don't see any explicit fault on the zoo's behalf for doing that because they were within compliance. The other thing that I think is interesting is when we look at the opinion of this primatologist, Franz de Waal, he actually mentioned in his 40 years of studying apes that the behavior of the gorilla in the video that we all saw seemed to indicate that the gorilla was being protective over the child. And that's kind of how I was feeling. And like you guys said, it was starting to get concerned and freak out and agitated when people started shouting and screaming and whatever. And he definitely is of the opinion that if the zoo, if the employees at the zoo had tried to calm the crowd down, that could have de-escalated the situation to a point where they didn't have to resort to killing the animal. Because like V said, in the past when they've had incidences with toddlers and gorillas, the results have been very positive, or at least neutral, to where no actual harm came to the child. And it, just based on the video that we saw, it doesn't really seem like any explicit harm came to the child as a result of the gorilla's actions. I mean, other people would be like, oh, he dragged him around. Well, he drug him around through water. I doubt there was much beyond maybe a little bit of scuffing with the bottom. But really, I wouldn't anticipate too much damage from that. Whereas you hear other reports from a fire department chief that was there. He reported the child being thrown 10 feet into the air, basically. I mean, like I said, I didn't get to see the entire event, but that would obviously call into question whether the gorilla was being actually aggressive towards the child, because most of the time it seemed like he was actually defending the child from the crowd, which is why he was going further and further from the crowd with that child to protect it. The thing that bothers me is that there was this Facebook post that was shared over 1 million times, okay, by this lady, Amanda, who was a zookeeper for 2.5 years and loved working with gorillas. And she offered the opinion that the gorilla was using the child as a tool of intimidation, okay, to kind of thrash the child around and use it to create a lot of noise and big visuals to try to intimidate the crowd that felt threatened by. And I don't see that. And I'm kind of more inclined to trust the primatologist who has been studying apes for longer than the zookeeper has been alive on his opinion. So I didn't see intimidation, and he didn't either there. So it definitely seemed like the gorilla was taking a more defensive posture towards that kid and not actually trying to hurt it or use it as a tool for other means.
Yeah, one thing that I read about gorillas and just primates in general, because we are so closely related genetically, we should be able to read their behavior fairly easily. You know, they more or less behave like us. You know, they'll make loud noises. They'll you know, try to scare you before they attack you, stuff like that. And yeah, I totally agree. It did not seem to me like the gorilla was actively trying to hurt the kid. Like, from what I saw, I didn't see that ape trying to hurt the baby. And that's why I remain unconvinced that killing it was the right choice there. I mean, I don't know, maybe it was, but certainly very tragic, and you know, especially when you consider that it's an endangered species of gorilla, you know, makes it that much more tragic.
Yeah, and I was really surprised. It took me a long time to look it up, but tranquilizers are not as far along as I thought they were.
Yeah.
I was really thinking with the age of biological and biochemical discovery that we're in, we would be further along than that. But that's really disappointing. Saying is there are definitely some venom compounds in the natural world that can drop you within just a couple minutes. And so clearly we need to get better tranquilizers by using venom research. Not to plug my own field at all, but snakes can do a rather good job of that in any sized animal.
You know, I was thinking, like, isn't there some, you know, some agent that not so much puts you to sleep, but basically mildly paralyzes you really quickly?
Right. Yep.
The other thing I was thinking about was, you know, when we try to subdue a person that's been unruly, you know, we tase them. Now, that
I
may
had that
be
same
very
thought.
yeah, that may be very problematic for a gorilla. They have a thick skin. It may take a lot more. You may just upset it if it doesn't work. But you would think there's a better way to subdue a gorilla.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was an option to tase it, or even if they would tase a large animal like that. I'm curious though if even those little probes could get through, say, the hair on a gorilla. But I mean, I doubt that they would have so many animal rights activists, at their doorstep if that were to happen.
Which is strange because the alternative is shooting it, and that's going to give the same results. So it's kind of hard to please the animal rights activists.
Yeah.
Funny enough, but no,
Well,
that would have been a great idea. At least maybe later on, because as I understand, they eventually came out of the water onto dry land.
yeah. I think actually, I think I read the gorilla took the baby up a ladder or something to a higher spot, something like that.
So I would say that would be a better place that would allow tasing. Otherwise, you really don't want to tase them in the water.
Yeah, true. I don't know. You could probably, you could probably design a specialized taser, with different probes that get under your skin, that are sharper or who knows what, to better work on a gorilla. But
Just
yeah,
need
hindsight.
just need a Tesla coil at each enclosure.
Yeah. Man. Well, I mean, the interesting thing was, I think one of the other interesting things was there was, I think, at least two other gorillas in that enclosure, and they were able to call those two gorillas, and they left the enclosure, but Harambe wouldn't, which again makes me think, was he trying to protect the child? I don't know. It's
Something that people may ask as well is a zoo the right place for these type of animals? Of course, the zoos were in compliance with this, but should we really be keeping large, somewhat intelligent animals, trapped in these enclosures? Of course, they try to have, engagement and try to keep, motor skills and have activities for them. But should we really be having these animals in zoos for the public like this?
So two things about that argument strike me. One is that when you consider endangered species in general, especially critically endangered species, in some cases you end up in a situation sorry, some cases you end up in a situation where the animals that are in zoos are the only remaining animals of that species on the planet. And we've seen this in rhinos, which just recently became extinct in the wild, certain species. And so the only living members of that species are in zoos. So zoos are an important reservoir for animals that are especially critically endangered, like the lowland gorilla. The other thing that always kind of frustrates me is that people don't really understand very well the impact that zoos have as far as making people care about these animals. I mean, it's hard to care about something if all you see of it is a picture or maybe some video. But when you can sit there in an enclosure and look into a gorilla's eyes that are just 2 feet away from you on the other side of double pane glass, that's where you start to really see how smart that animal is, how it is almost like a young person. And it has its own individual feelings and personalities, and it's just trying to live out its life in the only way that it can. And that starts to kind of bring it back into perspective for you as far as why you would want to care about something that is not human. And that is when you can look directly into its eyes and watch it behave the way that it does in its enclosure. and you can start to really learn the animal, and learn to care about it.
Yeah, that's very true. Like my boys, towards the end of the school year, went to the zoo here in Fort Wayne, and I just remember one of them when we went to the orangutan, whatever, enclosure. They were actually pretty active, which on previous visits they weren't for some reason. They're usually pretty docile, but they were pretty active, and the boys sat there and watched them for about 10 minutes, and they're just swinging like people. Like, yeah. And then they paid more attention to the other artifacts they had around that enclosure, like the handprints and everything, and they're like, hey, they're almost just like us. Yeah. And that was a pretty good connection for 5-year-olds.
Yeah, I wish there was a better way for us to make that connection for kids without having to cage those animals, I mean, we know that caged animals don't behave like animals in the wild. In the wild, especially, for example, I don't know if you guys saw the CNN documentary a year or two ago, Blackfish, that talked about orcas. I mean, orcas are very intelligent. And one of the orcas that they talked about, Tilikum, I believe was his name, has killed 1 or 2 of his trainers. In the wild, orcas are not aggressive towards humans. And it wasn't an accidental thing. And I think actually even tried to kill another, but somehow that didn't happen. It was a very deliberate thing where that orca basically grabbed the trainer by their foot and just dragged them down to the bottom of that pool and just didn't let go for a while. So, I wish there was a better way for us to, perform those very beneficial functions that Chris, you mentioned, helping to repopulate, those animals in the wild, connecting us to those animals, making us understand what those animals are about. I would hope that zoos today don't use wild caught animals. I would hope that those are animals that needed some form of rescue, that couldn't be returned back into the wild, and are maybe, the offspring of such apes that, again, or various species that just don't have the experience to be led back into the wild. But if we just keep an animal, we catch it in the wild and put it in a cage for our own entertainment, that part of it strikes me as immoral.
Well, in the future, we're hoping to have more eco parks, so to speak, that are much more efficient at accomplishing both goals. To have animals in their natural habitat, but still have maybe some sort of trail, or some sort of system that allows humans to observe them without putting the humans in danger. Obviously, that would be the perfect solution later on down the line, and we're trying to go in that direction. It's just, in the meantime, it's still much more economical to just go the zoo route and create artificial, small, very regulated and enclosed habitats in order to try to accomplish as much as we can in the very small space with the very small amount of resources that we have. And that was actually something that kind of bothered me about some of the comments I was seeing, especially some of the comments spurring off that zookeeper's Facebook post, was how people were denouncing how little zoos actually contribute monetarily to the conservation of a species. Because, there are some big zoos that can actually, donate maybe 1% of their total ticket price to the Gorilla Conservation Fund or something. It's just that a lot of zoos don't have that kind of monetary resource to be able to do that. And so people are griping about that. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, but there's downstream effects, right? So because you're getting people in there to care about these animals, they're going to be much more apt to donate to those kinds of causes on their own accord, without having to go through the zoo directly. And so I really didn't see that as being a downside, so to speak, to zoos, because zoos are still out there getting people to care about animals, regardless of whether they donate a certain amount of their proceeds to these other conservation funds or not. Because honestly, if you've ever looked at zoo salaries, I mean, zookeepers get paid minimum wage typically. And so zoos are running on a thread because they have to spend so much money and resources just caring for the animals. And they try to do the best they can with what they have.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not easy to feed the tigers, 15, 20 pounds of meat a day probably. Having a few of those around will cost a lot of money. And yeah, zoos are not a big money-making machine. Just because you see a lot of people going through them doesn't mean they're making tons of money. They're barely breaking even, probably in most cases. So yeah, their function, their beneficial function, is definitely getting the awareness. So people are aware of those animals. Getting to know them, learning about them. Having the interesting facts there, learning where those animals can be found in the world. The education purpose, it definitely is a positive aspect of zoos.
That's why zoos have a gift shop, so they can
Right.
make some of that money up.
Yeah. It sucks that all the zookeepers, as Chris you mentioned, they're getting paid next to minimum wage. I had heard that before, and man, it's a thankless job. It's hard caring for those animals and being there, and those animals don't care if it's Christmas Eve. They don't care if it's a Sunday. They need to be cared for. They need their cage cleaned. They need to be fed. All that, and because they're in an enclosure, we have to do that for them. It's not like we can just leave them there. So I can imagine it being a bit of a thankless job. One thing that I found very interesting, I believe it was after Katrina hit New Orleans, there was a zoo down there, and some of the firefighters were taking turns, swinging by the zoo, because the animals that were still there were so used to people. When people weren't there, they would get depressed and all that. So it was good for them to have the people there. I don't know, just tossing that out as an interesting fact. I thought that was pretty neat. Just seeing how used to us those animals are.
I mean, yeah. If you think, most creatures are social animals, and that human interaction becomes part of their tribe, if you will. So, I mean, if you've been up to Black Pine Animal Sanctuary up in Albion, I remember when I went there during a field trip, they had a large parrot. It might have been like a macaw or something, but it had pecked off all of its breast feathers because it was separated from other birds, and while in transit from from zoo to zoo or from zoo to sanctuary, it got lonely, and it didn't have that interaction, so it started stressing out, and when it stressed out, it started picking its feathers out. So I mean, you can definitely see that in many animals.
And they actually think that was something else that could have helped this particular situation with the gorilla. Just that with the gorilla getting frustrated and confused, with the crowd screaming at it, they believe that might have helped the situation to not only calm down the crowd and keep them from screaming and causing an uproar, but to also back off the crowd, so they're out of visual range of the gorilla, so he wasn't freaking out additionally, and instead surround him with the keepers that he's used to seeing. Have a familiar face to help comfort you while you're freaking out, essentially. And this was also another thing that's kind of related to that particular case was the notion that gorillas are these dangerous predators. And so that struck a chord with some people because gorillas are actually vegetarians. They're not terribly interested in eating a child unless he was covered in lettuce, or something. So save for a toddler salad, a gorilla is really not going to care about eating that toddler. So that's some interesting points there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Now, another case that I thought I'd bring up that's somewhat related, where zoo animals were put down, that happened not too long ago, was this guy decided to commit suicide by lion or tiger. I don't remember which one it was, but it was one of the big predator cats, where he jumped into their enclosure hoping to be eaten alive. And I think in that case, they shot 2 of the big cats, if I remember correctly. And that's just awful. In that particular case, that guy's life was in danger, but by trying to end his own life, he ended the life of 2 big cats. They can also be endangered in certain parts of the world. And it's just really sad all around.
Yeah, that was really sickening hearing that story, especially when they tried to relate it to some sort of divinity. That God saved him, and it's like, no, I think a couple of high-powered rifle rounds saved you.
Yeah. Those bullets saved you.
Yeah, right. But that was the thing. Like, I don't know how many of you looked into much with that gorilla story, but that was one of the things that the mother was shouting at the time too, while her toddler was down in the moat. She was shouting, "Please protect him, God! Please protect him!" And then after this whole scenario goes over, she does a few Facebook posts, and in the Facebook post, she's like, "We're so thankful to the Lord that our child is safe." And it's like, well, so either God allowed the child to go into the dangerous situation in the first place, or he was the one getting your child out of the situation via the person who shot the gorilla. So which one is it?
So he either made it happen or let it happen. Either way, he gets the praise for it.
Jingly keys, jingly keys. Look over there.
I never understand that.
He needed a dark, hairy angel.
He's got one more angel now. A very hairy angel.
People can be very dangerous to animals. We think animals are dangerous to us, but I don't know. in one-on-one, it's very interesting. In one-on-one combat, we probably can't hold our own against any animal, but man, when we're in the group, we can destroy entire species.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much, and I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you again later.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and Secular Fort Wayne on Meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.